What you doing this weekend? Got any big plans? If for some reason you happen to find yourself in or around Dallas, Texas, there's a brand spanking new attraction that just popped up right in your own backyard. Introducing the George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum. Yesterday was the grand opening of the new Bush Library for the general public, and this weekend marks the library's long-anticipated inaugural weekend. And if you're going to be in Dallas over the next few days, I'm telling you, you just must check it out, if only for the shock value. Last night on this show, Rachel discussed the main attraction inside the new Bush Library, which is an exhibit called Decision Points Theater. It's basically an interactive game where you can reenact the biggest decisions that George W. Bush had to make as president. Decisions like, should we invade Iraq? The problem, as Rachel pointed out last night, is that when you try to say, no, we should not invade, please let's do anything but invade Iraq, President Bush pops up on the screen and starts making the case of all the overwhelming evidence against Saddam Hussein. Evidence that has since been thoroughly discredited. 10 years later, in what's supposed to be a library, is being taught as fact that Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat who must be dealt with unilaterally if necessary. So there's a certain shock value to the new Bush Library. But if the Iraq War isn't exactly your thing, if you want to relive the glory of another Bush decision, the George W. Bush Library gives you the opportunity to do that.
Take a look at the list of scenarios in front of you. First, you will select which one you want to tackle.
The majority of the theater chose Hurricane Katrina.
Yep, Hurricane Katrina. What is the decision point that the Bush Library asks you to confront when it comes to Hurricane Katrina? A disaster in which nearly 2,000 Americans died, many in their own homes. What's the decision point that's laid before you at the Bush Library?
Officials in New Orleans are overwhelmed. The president can send in troops, but those troops would serve in a supporting role to state efforts and would not have law enforcement powers unless the president invokes what's called the Insurrection Act. President Bush had to make a choice. 1, rely on the National Guard and local police. 2, send in federal troops in a supporting role with no law enforcement authority. 3, invoke the Insurrection Act and send troops to restore order.
Excuse me, restoring order was the problem when it came to Hurricane Katrina? Seriously? The main dilemma faced by President Bush when it came to the government's response to Hurricane Katrina was quelling disorder? The Bush Library takes you through this whole scenario about how to deal with the problem of looters and how to restore law and order in New Orleans. That is the decision point. No mention at all of, search and rescue. 8 years later, the people of New Orleans who were basically left to starve and dehydrate and die in our city, mostly elderly people and children. 8 years later, these people are memorialized at the Bush Library as public enemies, not as citizens who were in need of relief.
Americans are facing lawlessness and chaos. We need to send in federal troops and declare the city in a state of insurrection so our troops have the legal authority they need to restore order.
Look, federal troops aren't trained police officers. There's a danger that sending them in will put them in harm's way without the ability to defend themselves or the training necessary to apprehend violent criminals.
I decided that sending in federal troops with diminished authority was better than sending in no federal troops at all. It was what the crisis required, and the troops helped restore order in the city.
Okay, the legacy of Hurricane Katrina that's on display at the Bush Library is that order had to be restored to the lawless and violent city of New Orleans. And thank goodness President Bush was there to make the right call. Wow. This game at the Bush Library is supposed to make you feel the intense pressure of the presidency, the minute-by-minute decisions that you have to make as developments unfold all around you.
One of the most powerful hurricanes in several decades.
Levee broke yesterday, another levee broke today.
Water is rising so fast.
There's no food, no water, no electricity.
It's getting increasingly chaotic in New Orleans. The city's Homeland Security chief says there are gangs of armed men moving around the city.
Now, we need help now.
Time's up. Okay. It's time to make a decision.
So it should be noted that the level of urgency that's on display inside Decision Point Theater was not so much on display when it came to the decider himself. This was President Bush the morning that Katrina made landfall, sharing a cake with John McCain in Arizona. This was after his administration had already been informed that levees in New Orleans had been breached. This was President Bush on day 2 of the disaster, yucking it up with a country music star in Southern California. That night, as the situation was growing worse and worse in New Orleans, George W. Bush decided to return to his ranch in Crawford, Texas, to finish up his vacation. When he finally headed back to D.C. the next day, President Bush got an aerial view of the damage in Louisiana and Mississippi. But by Friday, 5 days into that disaster, his aides at the White House were putting together DVDs of news coverage to convince President Bush how bad things were in New Orleans. During those 5 days, President Bush was not on the edge of his seat, as the Bush Library would like you to believe. He was basically checked out. That's the real history. The truth is, the American people have already decided how they felt about President Bush's leadership during Katrina. And while his approval ratings before Katrina weren't that impressive, they never recovered afterwards. 15 months after the failed response, Democrats took control of the House. They took control of the Senate, and they took a majority of gubernatorial seats across the country. The public has already decided. But hey, if you're in Dallas this weekend and you've got some time, go see how President Bush saved a city from disaster and restored a sense of calm in all the disorder.